When an empire falls, it is not merely palaces that are looted or borders that are redrawn. When an empire collapses, roads fall into disrepair, cities shrink, trade networks break apart, armies enter the service of local warlords, and the way people understand the world changes completely. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire was one of the greatest turning points in European history. But what if that collapse had never happened? What if Rome had overcome the crises of the 5th century and continued to exist? What if the empire had survived not merely for a few more centuries, but had transformed, divided, reunited, and endured all the way into the modern world? This alternative history begins in the year 461. The Western Roman Empire is ruled by Emperor Majorian, one of the last capable leaders of the declining state. In real history, Majorian was removed from power by the influential general Ricimer and was killed shortly afterward. His death destroyed nearly every remaining possibility of a Western Roman recovery. In this timeline, however, Majorian discovers the plot against him before it can be carried out. Ricimer's agents are captured near Ravenna, and documents proving the conspiracy are presented to the Senate. Ricimer is arrested and executed, while the most important commands in the army are given to officers who remain loyal to the emperor. This event alone cannot save Rome. The imperial treasury is nearly empty. Local authorities in Gaul no longer trust the central government. Much of Hispania is controlled by the Suebi and the Visigoths. In North Africa, the Vandals possess some of Rome's richest grain-producing territories. Majorian understands, however, that the empire's crisis is not caused only by barbarian invasions. The real problem is that the tax system has collapsed, great landowners have become increasingly powerful, and the institutions of the state have lost contact with ordinary people. Majorian first orders a complete registration of the great estates of Italy. Property belonging to senatorial families that have avoided taxation is confiscated. Regional courts of inspection are created to prevent imperial officials from keeping part of the taxes they collect. Soldiers are no longer rewarded mainly with land. Instead, the state begins paying regular salaries. Gothic, Frankish, Alan, and Hunnic soldiers serving in the Roman army are no longer treated as temporary mercenaries. They become imperial soldiers who can earn full Roman citizenship after completing a fixed period of service. These reforms provoke the anger of the great aristocratic families. Yet Majorian does not abolish the Senate. Instead, he restructures it. Representatives from wealthy cities in Gaul, Hispania, and Africa are invited to take seats in the Roman Senate. The Senate slowly stops being an institution controlled only by the noble families of Italy. It begins to resemble an assembly representing the different regions of the empire. The true turning point arrives in 468. The Eastern and Western Roman fleets organize a joint campaign to recover North Africa from the Vandals. In real history, this expedition ended in disaster near Cape Bon. Rome lost hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, and much of the wealth it had gathered over many years. In this timeline, Majorian receives advance warning that the Vandals are preparing to attack with fire ships. During the night, the Roman fleet withdraws into open water. The Vandal fire ships are sent toward empty coastal positions, while the Roman navy launches a counterattack the following morning. After several months of siege, Carthage surrenders. The Vandal king Genseric is sent into exile in Constantinople with his family. Some Vandal soldiers are incorporated into the imperial army, while much of the land in North Africa is returned to state ownership. Grain, olive oil, and gold from Africa begin filling the treasury of the Western Roman Empire once again. The collapse of Rome is not merely delayed. A completely different process of transformation begins. When the year 476 arrives, there is no child emperor sitting helplessly on the Western throne. A military commander named Odoacer does not depose the last emperor and send the imperial insignia to Constantinople. Instead, the Western Roman Empire still exists. Its borders are narrower than they were during earlier centuries, but it continues to control Italy, Gaul, Africa, and parts of Hispania. State revenue has recovered. The army has been reorganized. The authority of the central government has been restored. After Majorian's death, the empire once again enters a period of crisis. This time, however, the continuity of the state no longer depends entirely on the will of a single ruler. The Roman Senate, military commanders, and provincial representatives establish a common electoral system. A new emperor may still be proclaimed by the army, but he must also receive the approval of the Senate and the provincial assemblies. The system does not always function peacefully. Coups, rebellions, and civil wars continue. Yet none of them causes the complete destruction of the state. At the beginning of the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian comes to power. Instead of finding a ruined West, he faces a recovering sister empire. Because Italy and North Africa have not been lost, Justinian has no reason to begin the long and devastating wars of reconquest that occurred in real history. Instead, Rome and Constantinople negotiate a new agreement. The empire is officially divided into two administrations. Rome becomes the capital of the West. Constantinople becomes the capital of the East. Each administration has its own treasury and army, but foreign policy, commercial law, and Roman citizenship remain shared. Latin continues as the main language of administration in the West, while Greek dominates in the East. Both capitals consider themselves the true center of Roman civilization, but they cooperate whenever they face a common enemy. This arrangement transforms the Mediterranean into a unified economic region once again. Grain ships leaving Alexandria sail toward Constantinople and Rome. Minerals from Hispania are processed in workshops in the east. Wines from Gaul are carried to Egyptian ports. Olive oil from North Africa reaches military garrisons along the Rhine and the Danube. Maintaining Roman roads and ports becomes one of the most important responsibilities of the provincial governments. Yet the survival of the empire does not mean the end of every crisis. In 541, a devastating plague spreads across the Roman world. Tens of thousands of people die in Constantinople. Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, Rome, and Massilia become major centers of infection. The population declines. Fields are abandoned. Recruiting soldiers becomes increasingly difficult. The survival of the Western Roman administration changes the response to the epidemic. Physicians in Rome and Constantinople observe that the disease spreads through port cities and grain warehouses. They do not yet understand the direct connection between rats, fleas, and infection, but they begin isolating ships, cleaning storage buildings, and placing the sick inside separate facilities. The practice of quarantine, based on a waiting period of 40 days, becomes standard across much of the Mediterranean centuries earlier than it did in real history. The plague still kills millions. But because municipal governments continue to function, aqueducts, sewer systems, and public granaries remain in operation. Urban life in Western Europe is interrupted, but the enormous collapse of cities that defined real medieval history never fully occurs. In the 7th century, Rome faces the rise of a powerful new movement. The birth of Islam in Arabia transforms the political balance of the region. Within a few decades, Arab armies advance into Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. The Eastern Roman army suffers heavy losses after years of war and disease. Damascus and Jerusalem fall under Muslim control. Alexandria changes hands several times before Rome finally loses most of Egypt. In this timeline, however, the Western Roman navy remains powerful. Arab fleets are prevented from taking control of the entire Mediterranean. Carthage, Sicily, Crete, and Cyprus become heavily fortified centers of naval warfare. The interior regions of North Africa gradually pass under the control of new Islamic states, but Rome retains several coastal cities. For centuries, Carthage becomes a frontier metropolis where Latin Christians, Berbers, Jews, and Muslim merchants live side by side. The Mediterranean is no longer the private sea of a single empire. It becomes a vast zone of both conflict and commerce between the Roman and Islamic worlds. The most important reason Rome avoids complete collapse is the transformation of its military. The system of military provinces used in the east is expanded into the west. Farmers living along the frontier receive land and tax reductions in exchange for military service. The army is no longer composed mainly of distant mercenaries. People living along the Danube, in Anatolia, Sicily, Africa, and Hispania become directly involved in defending the empire. This is also the period in which Roman identity changes. To be Roman no longer means being born in Italy or speaking Latin. A Greek-speaking farmer in Anatolia, a merchant of Celtic and Germanic ancestry in Gaul, a Berber soldier in Africa, or a Jewish lawyer in Hispania can all identify themselves as Roman citizens. The empire becomes a multicultural political structure built around shared law and citizenship. By the end of the 8th century, the Frankish kingdoms are becoming more powerful in northern Gaul. In real history, Charlemagne conquered much of Western Europe and was crowned emperor in the year 800. In this world, however, the Roman Empire still exists. There is no empty imperial title waiting to be claimed. The Frankish leader Carolus chooses cooperation instead of war. The Frankish territories of northern Gaul join the Roman system in exchange for broad autonomy. Carolus receives the title Protector of Gaul. Frankish soldiers defend the Rhine frontier, while Frankish nobles begin taking seats in the Roman Senate. This agreement completely changes the political future of Europe. Two separate kingdoms called France and Germany never emerge in the form known to our history. The provinces of Gaul, the Rhineland, Germania, and the Alpine regions continue to speak different languages and preserve local traditions, but they remain within the same imperial system. The centuries-long rivalry between France and Germany never develops. The situation in Britain is more complicated. The Roman army had already withdrawn from most of the island during the early 5th century. But as Rome recovers, it re-establishes contact with the Romano-British cities of the south. The kingdoms founded by Saxons, Angles, and Jutes become stronger in the east, while the Brittonic regions of the west receive military and economic support from Rome. Britain never becomes an ordinary Roman province again. Instead, it develops into a collection of semi-independent kingdoms and city alliances connected to the empire. Latin survives as the language of law, while Brittonic languages and Germanic dialects continue to develop together. Over the centuries, a new common language emerges. It is very different from the English of real history. It contains far more Latin vocabulary and preserves several elements of Celtic grammar. A distinct Britannian language is born. Viking attacks in the 9th century become a serious threat to the Roman world. Scandinavian raiders attack the coasts of Gaul, the ports of Britain, and northern Hispania. Yet instead of facing isolated and divided kingdoms, they encounter a coordinated naval defense system. The Roman navy cannot stop every raid, but coastal fortresses and communication towers make permanent Viking conquest much more difficult. Some Scandinavian leaders reach agreements with Rome and enter imperial service. In exchange for protecting the northern seas, they receive land along the coasts of Gaul and Britain. Within a few generations, these communities become Roman citizens. Scandinavian shipbuilding technology is adopted by the imperial navy, while Roman engineering spreads farther into northern Europe. Rome's survival does not mean that the Middle Ages never happen. Plagues, famines, religious conflicts, dynastic struggles, and local wars still occur. The major difference is that the production of knowledge is not restricted almost entirely to monasteries. State-supported schools in Rome, Constantinople, Athens, Alexandria, Carthage, Massilia, and Toledo continue operating. A large part of the literature of ancient Greece and Rome is never lost. The works of Aristotle, Archimedes, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy survive in both Greek and Latin copies. At the same time, the Roman world remains open to scientific advances coming from Islamic civilization. Algebra, astronomy, and medicine developed by scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Bokhara reach Roman universities through the ports of the Mediterranean. During the 9th century, Indian numerals and the concept of zero begin to be used in Roman financial administration. At first, traditional bureaucrats who defend Roman numerals resist the new system. But because it makes taxation and commercial accounting far easier, it spreads rapidly. Roman numerals remain on monuments and ceremonial documents, while the number system used in the modern world becomes dominant in everyday mathematics. The religious structure of the empire also develops differently. The Bishop of Rome commands great respect in the West, but he never gains absolute political authority over the entire Christian world. He must cooperate with the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage. Emperors continue to interfere in religious debates, but they prevent any single institution from controlling all of Christianity. Differences in language, worship, and administration gradually grow between the Eastern and Western churches. Yet in order to preserve imperial unity, a great religious council is held in Thessaloniki in the year 867. The council recognizes the Latin and Greek traditions as equal. The Bishop of Rome is accepted as the leading authority of the Western churches, while the Patriarch of Constantinople becomes the principal authority of the Eastern churches. Both remain subject to decisions made by joint councils. As a result, the Great Schism of 1054 never takes place. Christianity does not remain completely unified, but it also does not divide into two permanently hostile blocks. Local churches continue worshipping in different languages and maintain different practices concerning marriage, fasting, and the lives of priests. In the 11th century, political conditions in the Middle East change once again. The movement of Turkic peoples toward Iran and Anatolia places increasing pressure on Rome's eastern frontier. When Seljuk armies enter Anatolia, they do not face an isolated empire ruled only from Constantinople. They face a unified Roman system capable of receiving soldiers and financial support from the West. A major battle takes place near Manzikert in 1071. The Roman army suffers serious losses, but it does not disintegrate. The emperor is not captured, and the entire defensive structure of Anatolia does not collapse overnight. Turkic communities begin settling in eastern and central Anatolia. Instead of trying to expel all of them, the Roman administration accepts many as military communities inside the frontier provinces. Over time, Anatolia becomes a region where Greek-speaking Christians, Armenians, Turkish-speaking Muslims, Syriacs, and many other groups live together. Some Turkish warriors join the Roman army. Turkish becomes widespread, especially in central Anatolia and along the eastern frontier. Cities such as Ankara, Iconium, and Caesarea develop into major commercial and military centers. Conflicts over Jerusalem continue, but the Crusades do not occur in the same form as they did in real history. Because there are no fully independent Western European kings, there are no separate armies of French, German, and English nobles marching east to create their own states. Instead, the Roman Senate collects taxes to organize large military campaigns intended to support the eastern provinces and secure the pilgrimage routes. Latin, Greek, Frankish, Germanic, Slavic, and Turkic Roman soldiers fight in the same armies. Jerusalem changes hands several times, but no permanent Latin kingdom is established there. Eventually, Rome negotiates with the Muslim states of the region and accepts the creation of a demilitarized city open to several religions. The agreement is not respected in every period, but it reduces the intensity of warfare over the Holy City. In the 13th century, Mongol armies shake the entire Eurasian world. They reach the lands north of the Black Sea, cross the Caucasus, and approach the borders of Anatolia. Roman armies suffer major defeats when they attempt to face Mongol cavalry in open battle. The government in Constantinople changes strategy and turns to diplomacy. Regular gifts are sent to the Mongol Khans. In exchange for recognition of the frontier and protection of trade routes, Mongol envoys receive commercial privileges in Roman ports. Roman engineers work in Mongol cities, while Roman and Asian merchants move across the expanding trade networks of Eurasia. Through these connections, paper manufacturing, gunpowder, the compass, and improved printing techniques spread from China toward the Mediterranean much more rapidly. Gunpowder is first used by Roman siege units near the end of the 13th century. The earliest weapons are heavy, dangerous, and inaccurate, but they begin transforming the design of fortifications. Tall stone walls are gradually replaced by lower and thicker defensive structures. Cannon foundries are established in the major cities of the empire. The spread of paper produces an even greater transformation. Compared with parchment, paper is far cheaper. Government records and books can now be copied on a much larger scale. By the beginning of the 14th century, the births, marriages, property ownership, and tax obligations of Roman citizens are recorded in centralized archives. Yet this powerful bureaucracy does not always benefit the population. The state gains a greater ability to monitor its citizens. Avoiding taxes, escaping military service, or disappearing from the attention of the central government becomes increasingly difficult. Rome provides security and administrative order, but it also becomes a state capable of intervening far more deeply in the daily lives of its people. In 1347, merchant vessels arriving from the Black Sea bring a new plague to Constantinople. The Black Death spreads across the Roman world within only a few years. Quarantine systems in the ports slow the disease, but they cannot stop it. Around 1/3 of the population dies. Some cities are abandoned almost completely. The imperial administration attempts to close borders, control trade, and isolate the sick. These measures succeed in some regions, but in others they provoke rebellion. People resist government officials entering their homes by force and sealing entire neighborhoods. When the epidemic ends, the Roman world has a smaller population, but workers have become more valuable. Landowners can no longer keep peasants tied to their estates as easily as before. Labor shortages cause wages to rise. Peasants and urban workers begin demanding better conditions. Major uprisings take place in several provinces. In order to prevent agricultural and industrial production from collapsing, the Senate is forced to expand the right of peasants to leave the land and seek employment in the cities. These developments produce a cultural transformation similar to the Renaissance, but it begins earlier and spreads across a much larger territory. Because ancient texts were never entirely lost, Roman thinkers do not see themselves as rediscovering the ancient world. Instead, they begin questioning the meaning of their continuous relationship with that past. By the end of the 14th century, new studies of anatomy, mechanics, geography, and political theory appear in Florentia, Mediolanum, Rome, Constantinople, Athens, Toledo, and Alexandria. Artists portray the human body more realistically. Architects use ancient techniques to construct new domes, bridges, and public buildings. The development of printing accelerates this transformation. The first major workshops using movable metal type are established in the Roman cities of the Rhineland during the middle of the 15th century. Books are printed not only in Latin and Greek, but also in the languages of Gaul, Hispania, the Slavic provinces, Anatolia, and the Arab-speaking regions. The government initially attempts to control the printing industry. Every book is supposed to receive imperial approval before publication. Yet it becomes impossible to supervise workshops operating in hundreds of different cities. Political criticism, religious debates, and scientific studies spread throughout the empire within only a few years. At the same time, maritime technology develops rapidly. The compass, improved coastal maps, and new ship designs make longer voyages into the Atlantic possible. Roman sailors from Hispania and West African ports travel south along the coast of Africa. Ships from Britannia and Gaul explore the northern Atlantic. In 1472, a sailor from Hispania named Marcus Colon presents a proposal to the Roman Senate. He argues that Asia can be reached by sailing west. After years of debate, the Senate accepts the expedition and provides a limited budget. Colon's fleet crosses the Atlantic and reaches the islands of the Caribbean. A new age begins for Rome. The first contacts are based on trade and military alliances. Iron tools, firearms, and horses carried by Roman ships produce a powerful impression on the societies of the Americas. But smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases brought from the Old World cause catastrophic epidemics among the indigenous populations. In some regions, the population declines dramatically within only a few decades. The Roman administration struggles to transform the new territories into ordinary provinces. Instead, commercial companies and military governors receive broad authority. These officials force indigenous communities into harsh systems of labor in order to obtain gold, silver, sugar, and other valuable resources. Some lawyers in the Senate argue that the peoples of the Americas are human beings and must therefore receive the protection of Roman law. Merchants and plantation owners respond that the colonies can remain profitable only through forced labor. Despite years of debate, exploitation continues. The transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic becomes one of the darkest periods in Roman history. Roman law theoretically forbids the enslavement of citizens. Merchants, however, claim that people living outside the empire do not possess the same protection. Millions of Africans are transported across the ocean to labor in the colonies. The survival of Rome does not prevent colonialism or slavery. On the contrary, the empire's strong navy and highly developed bureaucracy allow exploitation to be organized on a larger and more systematic scale. During the 16th century, religious criticism grows stronger. A theologian from Germania named Martinus Lutherus condemns the practice of claiming that sins can be forgiven in exchange for money. In real history, this dispute divided Europe into Catholic and Protestant states and caused generations of warfare. In this world, there are no independent German principalities capable of protecting Lutherus and forming entirely new states. His ideas receive support in some provincial assemblies, but he cannot create a separate political order outside the empire. Instead of executing him, the Roman government orders Lutherus to appear before a religious council in Thessaloniki. After years of debate, church financial practices are restricted. The translation of sacred texts into local languages is permitted. The education of priests is reformed. Some provinces adopt simpler forms of worship, while others maintain traditional ceremonies. The Roman world becomes more religiously diverse, but it avoids a vast war between competing Christian states. This also changes the development of scientific thought. The sun-centered model proposed by Nicholas Copernicus is debated in Roman universities. Some religious authorities oppose it, but because no single church institution controls the entire empire, the theory cannot be completely prohibited. When Galileo Galilei publishes his telescopic observations, he is questioned by religious authorities in Rome. Academies in Constantinople and Alexandria defend his work. Galileo is temporarily prevented from teaching, but he is not sentenced to lifelong house arrest. His observations are considered useful for navigation and calendar reform, and the state begins using them. By the end of the 17th century, the Roman world has become one of the largest economic regions on earth. From Britannia to Egypt and from Hispania to Anatolia, merchants use shared weights, similar commercial laws, and a common currency system. Low internal customs duties allow goods to be sold across an enormous market. Yet the empire contains major inequalities. The cities of Italy, Gaul, Britannia, and Western Germania become increasingly wealthy, while parts of the Balkans and Africa remain poor regions supplying raw materials. Wealth from the colonies accumulates in the hands of powerful commercial families. The use of coal increases in the mines of Britannia and Gaul. Deforestation and the growth of cities create a greater demand for new energy sources. The first steam engines are developed in the early 18th century to pump water out of deep mines. These machines are soon adapted for textile workshops, metal production, and transportation. The Industrial Revolution begins not in a single independent country, but across the northwestern provinces of the Roman Empire. The ports of Britannia, the workshops of Gaul, the mines of Germania, and the banks of Italy support one another inside the same economic system. The first railways are built between the industrial cities of Britannia during the 1770s. Within a few decades, railway lines reach Gaul, Hispania, Italy, and the Balkans. The government establishes a common track gauge to prevent the railway network from being divided between competing companies. The decision allows the same trains to operate in every region of the empire. Industrialization creates enormous wealth, but it also creates terrible conditions in the cities. Children work in factories. Laborers spend as many as 14 hours each day inside industrial facilities. Air pollution and infectious disease spread through the manufacturing districts. Roman citizenship theoretically guarantees equality before the law, but the difference between rich and poor becomes increasingly severe. Seats in the Senate remain largely controlled by wealthy families. The imperial government rules hundreds of millions of people, but only a small percentage of the population has meaningful political influence. In 1789, protests beginning in the Gallic city of Lutetia spread across the entire empire. People demand lower bread prices, an end to tax privileges, and stronger provincial assemblies. The demonstrators argue that Roman citizenship must become more than a promise written on paper. When imperial soldiers fire on protesters, the rebellion grows. Some military units in Gaul refuse to follow orders. Workers in Hispania, Italy, and Britannia declare strikes. Students in Constantinople demand the restructuring of the Senate. For the first time, the Roman government faces the possibility of a revolution spreading from within every part of the empire. Some generals advise the emperor to dissolve the assemblies and impose military rule. But the loyalty of the army is uncertain. In 1792, an extraordinary assembly of citizens meets in Rome and approves one of the most important constitutional settlements in imperial history. The powers of the emperor are severely limited. An elected House of Representatives is created beside the Senate. New taxes, declarations of war, and the federal budget now require the approval of both chambers. The empire does not end, but absolute government does. Rome becomes a constitutional federation. The provinces receive the right to control education, local security, and cultural policy. The central government remains responsible for defense, foreign affairs, the common currency, and major infrastructure projects. The constitutional reforms do not immediately abolish slavery. Colonial landowners and merchants place enormous pressure on the government to preserve the system of forced labor. Opposition grows among African provinces, religious communities, and workers' movements inside the industrial cities. In 1812, the House of Representatives prohibits the slave trade throughout Roman territory. The complete abolition of slavery is not achieved until 1828. People released from slavery receive little land and limited economic support. As a result, many formerly enslaved communities continue living in poverty. The 19th century becomes one of the strongest and most contradictory periods in the history of the Roman Federation. Railways, telegraph lines, and steamships connect every part of the empire. A message sent from Rome can reach Londinium, Constantinople, Carthage, or Alexandria within hours. Anatolia becomes the main transportation corridor between Europe and Asia. Constantinople grows into one of the largest ports in the world, while Ankara becomes a major railway junction connecting the interior provinces. Smyrna develops into the center of Aegean trade. The Turkish-speaking population of Anatolia gains increasing representation in the provincial assemblies. Throughout the empire, different peoples begin placing greater importance on their languages and cultural traditions. People demand Gallic education in Gaul, Germanic education in Germania, Britannian education in Britain, Slavic education in the Balkans, and Greek, Turkish, and Armenian education in Anatolia. The Roman administration initially attempts to preserve a common identity by making Latin compulsory in schools. When it becomes clear that suppressing local languages encourages rebellion, the government accepts a multilingual education system. Latin remains the common language of federal administration and higher education, while every province may use its own language in official affairs. Nationalism does not disappear. Some groups want to leave the federation and establish independent states. Separatist movements emerge in the Balkans, North Africa, and parts of Britannia. The Roman army sometimes suppresses these movements with great violence. The continuity of the empire prevents the full rise of European nation-states, but it does not eliminate the desire of peoples to determine their own political future. Roman citizenship offers a shared identity, yet people remain deeply connected to their region, language, and local community. The rest of the world is also transformed. China modernizes its centralized imperial structure and becomes Rome's greatest commercial rival. Roman trading companies gain influence in India, but the entire subcontinent is never conquered directly. Local kingdoms and powerful city alliances preserve their independence by alternating between warfare and negotiation with Rome. States centered in Iran remain Rome's most important rivals in the East. The Islamic world is never unified beneath a single political authority. Different governments rise in Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, and Arabia. These states sometimes fight Rome and sometimes cooperate with it to control trade between Europe and Asia. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Roman Federation contains hundreds of millions of people. Its common market and railway system accelerate economic growth, but inequality between the provinces remains severe. The industrialized northwestern territories are far wealthier than the agricultural regions of the south and east. In 1911, a crisis along the Danube begins, dragging the Federation into a major war. Independent kingdoms in northeastern Europe and an eastern alliance centered in Iran want to reduce Roman influence in the Balkans and the Caucasus. The assassination of a frontier governor triggers a series of military mobilizations. The Roman Federation enters the war together with its Atlantic territories and Mediterranean allies. It faces a coalition of northeastern European states, several Central Asian khanates, and the Iranian alliance. The war quickly becomes a conflict of trenches, machine guns, poison gas, heavy artillery, and industrialized destruction. The front lines in Gaul and the Rhineland remain almost unchanged for years. Balkan cities change hands repeatedly. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers die in eastern Anatolia. Submarines sink merchant vessels throughout the Mediterranean. The war ends in 1917 because both sides are exhausted. The Roman Federation does not collapse, but the reputation of the central government is badly damaged. After millions of deaths, anti-war and independence movements grow stronger in many provinces. The peace settlement grants broad autonomy to several eastern territories. The colonies receive representation in the federal legislature. The word empire begins disappearing from official documents. The state adopts a new name: the Federation of Roman Peoples. The imperial office continues to exist, but the ruler now performs only symbolic and constitutional duties. The years following the war are not peaceful. Economic crisis, unemployment, and inflation encourage the rise of radical political movements. Some groups demand a return to the old military discipline of Rome and the abolition of provincial autonomy. Others demand the complete destruction of the Federation. The global financial crisis beginning in 1929 reaches the Roman cities. Factories close. Banks collapse. Millions lose their jobs. An authoritarian movement known as the New Legion becomes powerful in Germania and northern Italy. Its leaders argue that Rome is approaching collapse and can be saved only through a single centralized government. Members of the New Legion attack political opponents in the streets. Several generals begin supporting the movement. Yet Rome's federal structure and long parliamentary tradition make it difficult for the movement to seize the entire state. Britannia, Gaul, Africa, and Anatolia announced that they will not recognize a central dictatorship. In 1934, New Legion forces attempt to march on Rome. Military units loyal to the federal constitution stop them before they reach the capital. The movement's leaders are arrested. The Roman world avoids the creation of a vast fascist dictatorship, but authoritarian ideas do not disappear. Militaristic states continue rising in other parts of the world. A major war in East Asia threatens Rome's Pacific territories. An expansionist government in Iran claims control over Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. Conflict beginning in 1939 develops into another global war. The Roman Federation combines the industries of Gaul, Britannia, Italy, Africa, the Balkans, and Anatolia. The Strait of Constantinople becomes one of the most strategically important locations in the world. Factories in Ankara and Caesarea produce aircraft and armored vehicles. The ports of Alexandria and Carthage supply the African front. Rocketry, radar, nuclear physics, and the first electronic calculation machines develop rapidly during the war. Scientists from universities in Rome, Alexandria, and Londinium work together on an atomic research program. In 1945, the Roman Federation produces its first nuclear weapon. Before the weapon can be used against enemy cities in the Pacific, the opposing government agrees to surrender. No nuclear bomb is dropped on a populated city. Even so, the tests demonstrate that humanity has acquired the power to destroy its own civilization. When the war ends, the Roman Federation remains one of the most powerful political structures in the world. But the peoples of the colonies are no longer willing to accept Roman rule. Territories in Africa, the Americas, and Asia argue that they do not possess rights equal to those of the European provinces. The Federal Equality Act of 1948 grants representation in the Roman assemblies to citizens of every overseas territory. Independence movements continue despite the reforms. Some regions choose to remain inside the Federation. Others become independent states through referendums. The Roman government does not behave peacefully everywhere. Independence demonstrations in several regions of North Africa are suppressed with violence. Long rebellions take place on Atlantic islands and in mining regions of the Americas. The colonial history of Rome becomes one of the most controversial subjects in federal politics. In 1956, the Roman Senate approves a law allowing a territory to leave the Federation through a popular vote. The decision represents a historic transformation. The state is no longer officially an empire that preserves its territory by force. It has become, at least in theory, a voluntary political union. Scientific competition accelerates after the war. A space race begins between the Roman Federation and an Eastern alliance centered in China. One of the most important Roman rocket facilities is established on the southern coast of Anatolia. Launches from the Mediterranean are supported by additional bases near the equator in Africa. In 1962, a Roman spacecraft completes the first unmanned flight around the Moon. In 1966, the three-person crew of the Marcus Aurelius space mission lands on the lunar surface. When the commander steps onto the Moon, he declares that the roads of Rome, after 2,000 years, have finally reached beyond the Earth. The flag planted on the lunar surface contains a modern version of the ancient Roman eagle. The mission, however, is not presented as a victory belonging only to the city of Rome. The crew includes an engineer of Anatolian origin, a pilot from Britannia, and a scientist from an African province. The Federation uses the space program as a symbol of its multicultural identity. During the 1960s and 1970s, social movements grow stronger throughout the Roman world. Women demand political and economic equality. Citizens descended from former colonial populations organize protests against discrimination. University students call for an end to the influence of old aristocratic families inside the Senate. Women had already gained voting rights in several regions, but complete political equality at the federal level is accepted only in 1968. Discrimination in the workplace is prohibited. Provincial administrations are prevented from applying different legal standards to ethnic and religious communities. The common language of the Roman Federation also changes. After centuries of contact with local languages, Latin becomes very different from the language of the classical period. Federal Latin uses simplified grammar and includes thousands of words from Gallic, Germanic, Greek, Slavic, Arabic, and Turkish. It becomes a modern language of communication. People continue speaking local languages in daily life. Italian is used in Rome, languages resembling French are spoken in Gaul, Germanic dialects dominate Germania, Turkish and Greek are widely spoken in Anatolia, and Arabic and Berber languages are common in North Africa. Education in Federal Latin allows people from different provinces to communicate with one another. During the 1980s, computer networks begin linking Roman universities. The system is originally developed for military and academic purposes, but it soon becomes available to government institutions and private companies. Common legal and communication standards allow the network to spread rapidly across the Federation. By the middle of the 1990s, a system known as the Roman network is being used by hundreds of millions of people. Citizens can submit tax forms, register for education, and complete government applications online. The first programs capable of automatically translating regional languages into federal Latin are created. Yet Rome's 2,000-year bureaucratic tradition creates new dangers in the digital age. The state gains the ability to track travel, financial activity, and communication on an unprecedented scale. Systems created for public security are discovered being used to monitor political opponents. In 2001, major terrorist attacks strike government buildings in Constantinople, Rome, and Alexandria. The federal administration responds by approving broad security laws. Border controls are strengthened. Electronic surveillance becomes easier. States of emergency are declared in several regions. These policies create intense debate throughout the Federation. Supporters of the laws argue that Rome has survived throughout history only because it defended itself against external threats. Opponents respond that the survival of the empire cannot justify the permanent restriction of individual freedom. During the first quarter of the 21st century, the Federation of Roman Peoples consists of approximately 40 major provinces and many autonomous regions. Its central territories include Italy, Gaul, Hispania, southern Britannia, Western Germania, the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, several coastal regions of the Levant, northern Egypt, and the major cities of North Africa. Rome remains the official and ceremonial capital. The Federal Senate and the imperial residence are located there. Constantinople is the center of executive government, international commerce, and maritime transportation. Alexandria is widely regarded as the capital of science, medicine, and space research. Ankara has become one of the Federation's most important centers for defense technology and overland transportation. The city contains the Anatolian Provincial Assembly and several major federal research institutions. Smyrna, Thessaloniki, and Antalya are among the leading ports and tourist cities of the Mediterranean economy. The modern political structure of the Roman Federation is very different from the empire of the ancient world. The emperor or empress serves as a symbolic head of state and is elected for life by the Senate. Candidates are not required to come from one of the old dynasties. Citizens with long careers in law, diplomacy, science, or public administration may also be selected. The true head of the executive is the federal consul, who is chosen by the House of Representatives. The consul serves for a limited term and can be removed through elections. The Senate represents the provinces, while the House of Representatives is based on population. A federal constitutional court resolves disputes between the central government and the provinces. Roman citizens can travel throughout the Federation without passports. A common currency known as the solidus exists in both physical and digital form. Because the provinces possess very different levels of economic development, large development funds transfer resources from wealthy regions to poorer ones. This frequently causes political tension, especially in the northern provinces. Some citizens oppose using their taxes to finance projects in distant regions. Others argue that Rome has survived only because its resources have always been shared. The grain ships that once carried food toward Rome have been replaced by energy pipelines, high-speed railways, and data cables. Climate change has become one of the Federation's greatest problems. Drought increases across North Africa and central Anatolia. Large forest fires affect the Mediterranean coasts. Rising sea levels threaten Alexandria, Ravenna, and many other historic port cities. Rome's long engineering tradition responds with enormous infrastructure projects. Sea barriers, water recycling facilities, and solar energy fields are built across the Mediterranean. Vast electrical networks transport power from the Sahara toward Europe. The cost and environmental impact of these projects create new political disputes. Some parts of the Federation possessed the most advanced healthcare and education systems in the world. Poverty continues in former colonial regions and frontier provinces. Roman citizenship promises equal rights for everyone, but economic reality does not provide complete equality. The legacy of the past can be seen in every part of daily life. People pass 2,000-year-old aqueducts on their way to high-speed railway stations. Modern parliamentary buildings stand beside Roman forums. Motorways following the routes of ancient roads stretch from the Atlantic coast to the interior of Anatolia. Children are taught that Roman history was never a single uninterrupted story of progress. They learn that the empire repeatedly approached civil war, disease, economic collapse, and political division. The reforms of Majorian are remembered as the beginning of Rome's survival. Colonialism, slavery, military repression, and political persecution are also included in the official education system. Some political movements demand the return of ancient Roman greatness. Groups using eagle symbols call for stronger central government and renewed military expansion. Federalists respond that Rome survived not because of conquest, but because it repeatedly changed and incorporated new peoples into its political system. Separatist movements also continue to exist. Communities in northern Britannia, several African regions, and parts of the Balkans demand referendums on leaving the Federation. Some seek cultural independence. Others oppose the central government for economic reasons. Rome is no longer the only military superpower dominating the world. The Chinese Union, the Confederation of Indian Republics, independent federal states in the Americas, and several Islamic countries form the other major centers of global power. The international system is balanced between several great political and economic blocs. The culture of the Americas is also very different from the one known in real history. Because European colonies were not established mainly as separate English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese societies, the continent possesses a broader Latin-Roman legal tradition. At the same time, indigenous languages and African cultural traditions survive across much larger regions. There is no single United States of America controlling most of North America. The Atlantic Republics, the Mississippi Federation, the Canada-Britannia Union, and several indigenous confederations are among the continent's most influential powers. These states maintain close economic relations with the Roman Federation. Yet because of the destruction caused by the colonial period, they remain politically suspicious of Rome. Rome's presence in the Middle East has not solved every regional conflict. Religious, ethnic, and economic disputes continue. Most borders are based on provinces that developed over many centuries rather than states created suddenly by foreign governments during the 20th century. This causes some conflicts to remain limited, but struggles over shared cities and sacred sites continue to produce serious tension. Constantinople is now a vast metropolis with more than 20 million inhabitants. Churches, mosques, synagogues, ancient temple ruins, skyscrapers, and federal government buildings stand beside one another. High-speed railway tunnels and bridges connect the two sides of the Bosporus. Latin, Greek, Turkish, Arabic, and Slavic languages can be heard in the city's public squares. Citizens hold protests against elected officials near the imperial residence. The ancient hippodrome, where emperors once addressed the population, is used for major political gatherings and sporting events. The city of Rome resembles a living layer of history. Parts of the ancient Senate building have been incorporated into modern structures. Vehicle traffic is prohibited around the Forum. When federal leaders take office, they read a modernized version of an oath dating back to the Republican era. Behind every symbol stands a fundamental question. Did Rome truly never fall? The slave-based, militarized society of the 5th century has very little in common with the federal Rome of the modern age. The borders changed. The people changed. The religion changed. The language changed. The entire political system was rebuilt again and again. Perhaps the only way Rome could survive was by refusing to remain what it had once been. Had the empire rejected reform, the policies of Majorian might have delayed collapse by only a few years. Rome was not saved by the strength of its legions alone. It survived because it expanded the meaning of citizenship, allowed local peoples to participate in government, and abandoned ancient traditions whenever they became impossible to preserve. Even so, this continuity did not create a more peaceful or more just human history. Roman roads allowed armies to move more rapidly. Its advanced bureaucracy strengthened social services, but it also strengthened taxation and surveillance. Shared law protected people, while colonial governors used gaps in that same law to exploit millions. The continuous existence of scientific institutions accelerated technological progress. More advanced technology also caused weapons of mass destruction to appear earlier. The common market created great wealth, but that wealth was never distributed equally. The survival of Rome prevented some wars between nation-states. In their place, it created long conflicts between the center and the provinces. Some cultures survived under Roman protection. Others weakened inside a shared imperial identity. People were united under one system of citizenship, but the meaning of that citizenship remained disputed for centuries. A modern Roman citizen can travel from the Atlantic coast to central Anatolia without passing through a border checkpoint. The citizen can use the same currency and appeal to the same federal courts. Yet education, income, and confidence in the future still depend greatly on the province in which that person lives. The history of Rome across more than 2,000 years is also the history of humanity's attempt to balance order and freedom. During every major crisis, people believed that Rome was finally approaching its end. During the plagues, the Arab conquests, the Mongol invasions, the Black Death, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, and the colonial uprisings, the state repeatedly came close to destruction. Each time, Rome survived by surrendering part of its territory, abandoning some of its institutions, or destroying ideas about itself that had once been considered sacred. A state that had once been the personal possession of an emperor gradually transformed into a federation shared by its citizens. In the year 2026, the modern federal flag still carries the Roman eagle above the Senate Square. The stars surrounding the eagle represent the peoples of the federation. Beneath the symbol appears a single sentence written in Latin. Rome is not a city. Rome is a common agreement. In this world, Rome never fell. But it did not survive because it remained unchanged. It survived because it repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt itself. Perhaps that was the true secret of history's longest-lasting empire. Stone walls eventually collapsed. Palaces burned. Dynasties ended. Armies were defeated. Borders moved. But as long as people continued using the same roads, debating the same laws, and imagining themselves as part of a shared historical community, Rome continued to live. The small Italian city that had risen in the ancient world remained, 2,800 years later, not a lost civilization described only in history books, but a living political system shaping the lives of billions of people. The modern world might be more advanced. It might be more connected, more urbanized, and more open to cultural exchange. But it would also be more centralized, more bureaucratic, and far more heavily burdened by the weight of the past. People might still describe themselves as French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, German, or Turkish. Above all those identities, however, there would be another identity. Powerful, controversial, and almost impossible to escape. Roman. An identity that once connected the peoples of the Mediterranean would cross oceans, enter industrial cities, spread through digital networks, and eventually reach into space. Roman legions might no longer march along distant frontiers. Emperors might no longer rule the world from a single palace. Arenas, triumphal ceremonies, and the ancient gods might have disappeared into the past. But the central Roman idea would remain alive. The belief that different peoples could exist beneath a common system of law and citizenship. Whether that idea produced freedom or domination would never receive a final answer. Because even in a world where Rome never fell, history would not become a perfect story of progress. It would simply become another world shaped by different victories, different disasters, and different people.